So let me go straight to the point. Where the coherence comes from is actually we build a dashboard of indicators. So really, I'm coming from the quantitative side. We have seen quite a lot of presentation more on the policy side. So this will be more about the measurement. We have four main dimensions that we have identified. So one is really the strong dimension. So the focus is on the strength and the spread of economic activity. So here we look at the features that usually we address in flagship publication for OECD, like OECD Economic Outlook, Going for Growth, and so on. Then the second one is really bringing people at the center. So this is with the inclusive dimension. We actually look here, whether recovery can create more equal opportunities for all. In a sense, really, we're looking at income and jobs, the quality aspects of the labor markets to some extent. Then the third one is whether it's sustainable in the long run, so whether it's getting greener or just not. And the fourth one is really whether we can say something about how likely we are getting prepared to better withstand the shocks in the future. So what can we really learn from that? And what I would like to emphasize here is that actually this was something that the OECD started working on right on the heels of the crisis in February 2020. And we got a mandate by the ministers last year to really systemize all the work that's been produced on the policy side, on the indicators, in different directors of the OECD, soaking in the experiences of countries and so on, and to come up with something rather simple. So that's why here what you see is you just see 4 dimensions and 20 indicators. So 5 indicators per each dimension. So it's not meant to be comprehensive, and an SDG framework is not meant to tell everything, but to indicate some of the key aspects, what's going on. And, to do that, what we discussed is actually that really we had to put in place a very strong consultation process with a task force that was actually formed by the national experts from national statistical offices, first of all. So it was actually steered by the OECD Committee on Statistical Policy and Statistics. So this was the main body. So it's really coming from that, but in very, very close consultation with policy committees of Economic Policy Committee, Labor Policy Committee, Social, Health, Environment, and so on. And that was really what gave the credibility and the relevance of this framework to countries. And why I say that is because after 1 year, we actually, through all these discussions that we've had, we actually managed to get, with no objection, welcoming by the ministers in the last ministerial conference, so the main event of the OECD where all the ministers gather in October, to say, yes, we welcome this dashboard. It's useful to us. And we welcome that you report on it for the next 3 years, how we are doing. And also to have the measurement agenda clearly in mind in view of how you can map it then later on with policies. And what do we mean by measurement agenda is actually, it needs to be relevant in terms of time. So timeliness is really important. It needs to be also looking at sufficient level of granularity, of details, to understand not only, well, we have averages, we have medians and so on, but what's going on beyond that. So what are actually the key factors, drivers that we can really say something about, some of these issues going beyond the GDP. And what you see, for example, in the green dimension is exactly what Hans was referring to, is that we need to keep the key elements in check. So we need to have emissions, we need to have resource productivity, biodiversity, and pollution. And on top of that, we need to think whether we are doing the right type of investments or we are just locking ourselves in the old established practices. Another request that we received by the member is, well, we understand the SDG framework is very complex. And we have another publication that actually my team is producing now, is that monitors and develops a tool how to measure the distance of countries to achieving the targets, by taking COVID into consideration, by taking dynamic considerations into account. So that means, well, we know where we stand right now, we show it, but, how does COVID impact our long-term trajectories on achieving something by 2030? So this dashboard also has to be aligned with what SDGs are telling us. So we did a quick mapping here and we were specifically asked in the first instance to look at gender issues. And on that, actually, we are developing statistics. We have 6 indicators already fully disaggregated by gender. We are working towards more indicators having that component, but also other issues will come forward when we expand the gender. So let's see how it works in practice. This is something that you can see online, but let me just walk you very quickly through it and explain a little bit what I've been saying now on the process side, how it looks more practically. So on the strong dimension, what you can derive from it is on the left-hand side, we have a very simple way of showing what's going on for an average of one country of the OECD average, for example. And here, in terms of strength, we looked at the excess dates. So that's something that is worth keeping in check, especially with new modifications of virus coming in, and also depends on other indicators that we are tracking in the dashboard. Another thing is, well, in terms of resilience, there are many issues to be considered. So one of them that actually they all agreed on is actually to see whether people are vaccinated against COVID or not. And we see an increasing trend, in the OECD as an average. But of course, there is some heterogeneity across countries. Some are on the lower side, some are more on the upper side. Well, there are some contexts to be taken into considerations. To some extent, also, this refers to my initial point on political acceptability of reforms, or if you wish, in other words, basically trust of people in what government is showing that is doing. Again, what people have understandings about how they experience the COVID and so on. So going to these issues, one is the green, just to emphasize that even like a trivial issues like looking at greenhouse gas emissions, that we say, why should we keep reporting on that? I mean, it's been reported everywhere, but honestly, it's really important to keep track of seeing where we stand on some of the long-term trends. And what we are doing here is, because some of this data is actually really just, from 2019, so before the COVID. So now we are working on quarterly greenhouse gas emissions nowcasting. So that means that we bring into perspective years like 2020, 2021 to understand what is going on a quarterly basis. And doing so, then we can link it way better with the output levels. We can link it way better with productivity and other issues that matter for decoupling of emissions from growth, from other things. So that's why I brought it up. Now, the main component is social. One thing is that we see quite a lot of value in looking beyond only statistical data, in looking at data that tells us about perceptions of people. So here you see one about the financial hardship. So how people say that they find it hard to get by on their household income, so on what they earn. And what we see here is that actually, the situation seems to be sort of improving on average for the OECD. Some a little bit worse, of course, for women, as we see for many of indicators. There are several reasons for that I'm not going to delve into now. But also what we see is there's huge heterogeneity across countries. And we also see that there is quite large differences between countries, how men or women perceive it. So it must depend somehow on the institutional fabrics and on their contexts. So what is going on? We have to take into consideration the details matter. So what we are doing here is we just published the COVID-19 and well-being. So how people experience life in the pandemic. This has been launched last week. And we are dissecting the data. So we are looking at different groups of populations by gender, by age, by education, by income, and so forth. And you can clearly see here, there are different types of stories to be told compared to what we have just spotted by looking at the averages. You see that people with low income levels are scoring worse. I mean, it seems rather intuitive, but what is actually quite shocking is that over 30% of parents young adults and those also then from these low-income households have been suffering the most. So it's quite a big number, actually. Now, going further to that, it brings us to the traditional measure, which is actually what do we know about inequality? And here again, what I would like to emphasize is the big difference how countries stand on statistical reporting on inequality. Some they score very well, so means it's very low inequality. But when we look at a more granular level and we sort of start asking people, does inequality matter? Which dimensions of inequality do you consider matter the most for you? So looking at, taking into account their perceptions, then we see that something really deeper is going on. We see the forces that are driving some of the trends that cannot be really explained by purely looking at the statistical measures. Because otherwise, how do you relate some of the statistical evidence that we see in income inequality with the measures of how people perceive the works of governments, how do they trust the institutional setups, and so on. Again, here, we published just now, so that was actually just this week, at the annual anniversary of our WISE Center, so Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity Center at the OECD. We published a report, which is a more technical report, looking at different dimensions of well-being, but using survey type of data, using data on perceptions, and very much up-to-date type of data. So, coming down to February, March 2021. So not only looking only before COVID periods. So it's really interesting. And I invite you to have a closer look at it. What we see is that income inequality, if you're looking at different groups, that, there are big issues going on for people in the lowest income quintile. And this is actually a brand new data approach that we are using and that we are developing together with the Eurostat. It's using the nowcasting techniques. So this is really looking at the situation in 2019 and 20. So expanding the scope of the data that we used to have, before and could not tell us much about what's going on during COVID to what's actually really taking place here. And here also, we could already provide some very preliminary results for selected number of 20 OECD countries. And we also have intention to explore this further and also to link it to other aspects of recovery, including the green aspects of recovery. And this is something that I think that European Environment Agency has done a lot of very useful work in several of the reports that they have published earlier this year as well. And we will actually also like to, explore more possibilities on how to use that work and combine it with what we have found so far into making a good understanding of the nexus. So, and this is actually building on the report that I led earlier this year, is on bringing together two big issues. So green growth framework and the inclusive growth frameworks together in the so-called, as we call it, Inequality Environment Nexus report. And why? Because we really wanted to see what's going on from the point of different population groups. And that's what I have in mind. It's youth, women, workers primarily, and look at their exposure, their vulnerability in different fields of their daily lives, including issues such as housing, the access to crucial amenities outside of environmental sphere, so to health and healthcare, and also take into consideration socioeconomic issues such as income, wealth, age, occupation, location, and so forth. So to conclude, let me just wrap it up and saying that there is doing quite a lot of work on bringing together different policy responses using evidence. So I did not want to focus too much just on policies today, but rather be more data-driven, because this is really one of the prerogatives of what we're trying to do is to put science in the first space and then actually help to inform and map it with the right and tailored policies. And there is no solution that would fix it all. So we need to take into consideration very specific context. We need to look at very specific areas of social challenges, what challenges particular groups like youth are facing. We need to focus on the long-term issues such as green recovery and so forth. And just to wrap it up all, the economics should not be forgotten. Going beyond GDP does not mean that GDP is obsolete. No, it just need to be considered for what it has been designed to measure. And on the productivity issues, in terms of economic recovery, it will become clear that both green and social dimensions are becoming extremely, extremely important in consideration of economic policies, also from the perspective of this increased pace of digitalization that we are facing. So I would like to thank you. I will leave it here.